Okay, my name is Daniel Marsh, and I'm doing my presentation on male sexual anatomy and physiology. Um, I'm using Chapter 4 of the Human Sexuality in a World of Diversity book, written by Rathis. And the purpose of this presentation is to teach my students about human anatomy, specifically male anatomy. So on this first slide here, I have a diagram of the male reproductive system, and the purpose of this is to, hopefully by the end of the presentation, my students will be able to identify what we're going to be talking about here, and maybe even some functions of these. Some of what we are going to be talking about in this diagram is, starting up here, is going to be the penis, the epididymis, the testicle, the foreskin, the urinary meatus, the bulbourethral gland, which is this tiny one in here, also known as the Cowper's gland, as well as the ejaculatory duct, the seminal vesicle, and I think that's about it. So the reproductive anatomy is divided up into two main sections: external sex organs, which include the penis and scrotum, which obviously those are external of the body, and then there are the internal sex organs, which are the testes, the vas deferens, seminal vesicles, prostate gland, and Cowper's gland, which, as I said before, is also known as the bulbourethral gland. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the penis, which is the first part of the external anatomy. And as you see the diagram here, what's different about the penis is there is actually no muscles or bones. The tissue that it's made up of is erectile tissue, and there are two main types, which is the corpus sponginosum and corpus cavernosum. And as you can see here, the sponginosum is on the inside, where the cavernosum is on the outside. And then you have the glans penis, which is the penis itself, and then you have the urethra, which is this tube here, which is the exit for semen and urine, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then you have the corona, which is the head of the penis, which is actually just a projection of the sponginosum tissue upwards. And then you have the crura, which is this part down here, which actually anchors the penis into the body. So that is actually connected into it. And then you have the prepuce, or foreskin, which is commonly known. And the act of circumcision is actually taking off the foreskin off the penis, which is common in the US, but around the world about only 33% of people are actually circumcised. So the functions of the penis, mostly involved in sexual intercourse and using urination and ejaculation, which is specific to males, which is different from females, which who have two different holes. They have their vagina and urethra to urinate out of, which the male uses both for sex, the same hole. So the scrotum. The scrotum is also part of the external anatomy, and it is a pouch of skin that's responsible for holding the testes, and it's responsible for temperature regulation. And you have this muscle called dardos muscle, which is in the middle layer of the scrotum, and as I said before, it regulates temperature and surface area. So the way it works is, if there is cold outside, the muscle actually contracts, bringing the testicles upwards closer to the body to keep it warmer, and as well as spreading out the skin, which creates more surface area for the heat. And when it is warm out, the muscle relaxes, which brings it away from the body to keep it actually cooler. So the testes function, they secrete sex hormones, which is known as androgens, which is specifically testosterone. And then they produce germ cells, which is also known as sperm. And then they're connected with the hypothalamus and pituitary gland during puberty, and those two are both in the brain. And what happens during puberty is you have this increase of follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which is short is FSH and LH. And many people think that's only common in females during their period cycle, but is actually also prevalent in males as well. So then you have the testes anatomy here. Some of the vocab is interstitial cells, which are also known as lining cells, and those are responsible for producing testosterone. And then you have the seminiferous tubules, which are actually responsible for making the sperm. And then you have the epididymis here, which is where once the sperm is made, it is held before it's let go. And then you have the spermatic cord, which is made up of blood vessels and nerves, and the vas deferens, which is actually kind of what connects the testicle to the rest of the body and the rest of the reproductive system. So once the sperm is made, it goes up farther into the body. So as I just mentioned, the vas deferens, they're cylindrical tubules about 16 inches long that serve as a path for mature sperm to travel. They lie close to the skin and they're part of the spermatic cord. As you can see here, you have the testes with the epididymis, and then the vas deferens travels all the way up here, where it meets with more glands, which eventually goes to the urethra. And if you ever heard of a vasectomy, that is what males get, where they essentially just tie off the vas deferens so that the sperm can no longer make it out to the urethra and makes the male infertile. So seminal the seminal vesicles are two small glands about 2 inches long, and they open into the ejaculatory ducts. And what they're responsible for is nourishing the sperm. They contain fluids which are rich in fructose, and what this does is it adds nutrients to the sperm so that they can live longer and that they're actually healthier. Okay, and what we have next is the ejaculatory ducts, which I just talked about with the seminal vesicles. And these are ducts formed by the convergence of the vas deferens with the seminal vesicle through which the sperm passes through to the prostate gland and into the urethra. So if you see here, you have the vas deferens as well as the seminal vesicle and the ejaculatory duct, where these all kind of meet with the sperm and empty eventually out into the urethra, which is right here. Okay, next we have the prostate gland. These are a small chestnut-shaped glands, about 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and they secrete a milky alkaline fluid. And this alkaline fluid is used to neutralize the acidity in the vaginal tract for the sperm to have a prolonged survival. So in the vagina, it is very acidic, so what the prostate gland does is produce this alkaline or basic fluid to kind of neutralize it so that these sperm live longer when they're inside the vagina, so hopefully they'll have better survival when they could eventually get up to the uterus, which eventually the fallopian tube, so that they can meet the egg. And as you see here, this is a picture of a normal prostate, and this is a picture of an enlarged prostate. And if you've ever seen commercials for people with enlarged prostate or going problems, you can see that it pushes up on the bladder here, which is the reason that people often have to urinate so much when they have an enlarged prostate, which is inconvenient and a lifestyle problem for these people, unfortunately. Alright, and then next we have the Cowper's gland, which is also known as the bulbourethral gland, and this is responsible for lubrication of the semen. And as you can see down here, it is a very small gland right off the urethra, and it secretes a clear, slippery fluid in which the urethra, which appears in the urethra during sexual arousal, and it contains a buffer to help with vaginal acidity as well as some sperm. So similar to the last gland we just talked about, the prostate gland, it has a buffer which helps with the vaginal acidity, but this fluid happens when a male is sexually aroused, and it's also known as pre-ejaculate, when this little clear slippery fluid comes out of the penis, and it does contain some sperm, which is the reason that people who practice the pull-out method is not very effective, because the woman can still get pregnant because of this fluid, this pre-ejaculate, which comes out because of the sperm that it contains. Okay, so getting into some physiology, I'm going to talk about spermatogenesis, which is actually the production of sperm. So a little vocab here is spermatogenesis, which is the production of sperm, and then the seminiferous tubules, which we talked about before. These are the sperm-producing tubules. And then we have spermatocytes, which are early-stage sperm, and they contain 46 chromosomes. And then once they divide and contain 23 chromosomes, they're known as spermatids. And then eventually, when they're mature, they're known as spermatozoa. So on the next slide, we're going to get into a little bit of meiosis and spermatogenesis. So as you see here, I have a little diagram which explains a little bit of meiosis and spermatogenesis. So here you have the spermatocyte, which is the immature cell, and as you see, it has 2N there. And the reason for that is that means that it has 46 chromosomes. And then it has the first meiotic division, and that makes it into a spermatid, which contains 1N, which means that it has 23 chromosomes now. And then since it's meiosis has 2 divisions. So once this second meiotic division occurs, you now have 4 spermatids. And once again, they still have 23 chromosomes. And then these are what turn into the spermatozoa, which is a mature sperm. And they also contain 23 chromosomes. So once you have the 23 chromosomes from the male sperm and the 23 chromosomes from the female's egg, they come together to make the 46 to make the child and have that full karyotype with the child. Okay, and then the next physiological part of the male I'm going to talk about is an erection. It's caused by the engorgement of the penis with blood such that the penis expands and stiffens. And this expansion acts as a funnel for sperm during sexual intercourse. And as we talked about in the beginning, the penis has 2 types of erectile tissues, corpus sponginosum and corpus cavernosum. And the corpus cavernosum is actually the tissue that's more responsible for the firmness and enlargement of the penis. So, the erection's physiological effects. Stimulation occurs through reflexes. This is an involuntary reflex in contrast to a voluntary reflex. So as you see, moving my arm like this, I can do this when I want, so that's a voluntary reflex. But an erection is involuntary, meaning that it cannot just happen whenever you try to tell it to. This is also a spinal reflex. Now there are a couple types of spinal reflexes. When you touch the penis, this is known as a simple spinal reflex. So that signal is going straight to the spinal cord and back without totally going to the brain. So a way you could think of this is, say you're cooking and you touch a hot stove and your hand goes away real quick, and you before you really even realize that it's hot, that's because that reflex goes straight from your hand to your spinal cord and back without going to your brain totally before you can process it. And then you have a visual so if you're aroused visually and you're imagining something or something like that, your brain is stimulated because you are obviously thinking of it, and that's what adds to that the spinal reflex, which eventually causes the erection as well. So how a spinal reflex works, as you see here, this is a picture of a spinal cord, and first the penis is touched or stimulated, so you have the sensory receptors in the penis which realize that, notice that, and then the sensory neuron, which is this neuron right here, receives the signal, and this neuron enters the dorsal horn, and a spinal cord has a dorsal horn and a ventral horn, so this dorsal horn is specific just for sensory nerves. So then you have your interneuron here, which is responsible for interpreting the sensory receptor and actually putting it into a motor function, which is then received by the motor neuron, which exits the ventral root, which is opposite of the dorsal root, and this causes the motor function, which travels back to the penis, which right here it's a muscle, but this motor function travels back to the penis, which gives the signal for an erection. So on this slide here, we're just going to do a quick last overview of what we talked about here and some of the functions. So starting with the prostate gland, we talked about the prostate gland and how it is involved in adding that alkaline and the alkaline fluid, which is important in acting against the vaginal fluid. And then we talked about the penis here, which is the gland itself. And then we talked about the epididymis, which is important in storing the mature sperm. And then we have the testicle here, which is important in making the sperm. And then we have the foreskin, which is this layer of skin that overlaps the penis and is circumcised depending on culture and where you live. And then we have the Cowper's gland, or the bulbourethral gland here, which is important in adding that slippery fluid, which is also known as pre-ejaculate, which contains some sperm. And then we have the ejaculatory duct, which is met by the vas deferens, which is this long tube right here. And the ejaculatory duct and the seminal which is important in the nourishment of the sperm, meet together, which eventually empty out into the urethra. And then here we have the abdominal cavity and the peritoneum, which is the inner lining of the stomach. And then you have the anus, which is, you can also see in this diagram, in the colon. And you can also see the spinal cord here, which is made up in this diagram, is the coccyx and the sacrum. And the sacrum is important in the spinal reflex we talked about, because the nerve goes actually to the sacrum, through the sacrum to the spinal cord and then back out. And the sacrum is 5 fused vertebrae, which make a triangular shape, and then the coccyx are 3 to 5 fused vertebrae, which make up your tailbone. And then you have here your pubic symphysis, which is your pelvic bone in the front, and in males it is not as big of an opening here, but in females it is due to childbearing. So for my students, I have a diagram here which they're expected to label, and they're going to label the words that we talked about here and add a brief function. So then they're going to bring that to class next week, and then we're going to go over it with them, which is in the lesson plan that I'm submitting. And other than that, that's about it. Thank you very much for watching my presentation.